What if I told you that the most ancient spiritual system on Earth, created by black civilizations thousands of years before Christianity, was systematically erased from history when the Bible was compiled? What would happen if you discovered that powerful forces deliberately removed all references to this profound black spiritual tradition to prevent you from connecting with your true spiritual ancestry? This might sound absurd, even blasphemous to some. How could the most influential book in human history be responsible for erasing an entire spiritual tradition? It seems impossible, unthinkable. Yet the evidence is hidden in plain sight, scattered across ancient texts, archaeological findings, and in the silenced voices of our ancestors who practiced these sacred traditions long before the Bible existed. In this revelation, you will discover the shocking truth about how the Council of Nicaea and subsequent church authorities deliberately censored, altered, and eliminated texts that acknowledged the African origins of many spiritual practices. You will understand why certain books were excluded from the biblical canon. You will see how spiritual technologies and cosmic understandings that originated in ancient black civilizations were systematically removed from religious history. Most importantly, you will reclaim knowledge that has been hidden from you for centuries, knowledge about your spiritual heritage that powerful institutions never wanted you to access. This type of content few have the courage to share publicly. Prepare to question everything you've been taught about religious history. The revelations you're about to encounter have been suppressed for centuries, kept from public knowledge through deliberate academic omission and religious censorship. What you'll learn here isn't taught in schools or mainstream religious institutions, because this forbidden knowledge threatens the very foundation of established religious power structures. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The algorithms actively suppress content that challenges established religious narratives, and your engagement helps this hidden truth reach others who are also seeking answers. Are you ready to discover the spiritual tradition that the Bible was designed to make you forget? Comment "Reveal the truth" below if you're prepared to embark on this journey of forbidden knowledge. The Bible as we know it today is considered by millions to be the divine word of God, a complete spiritual guide for humanity. But is this the whole truth? What if I told you that the Bible as we know it represents only a fraction of the spiritual wisdom that once existed? A carefully curated selection designed to advance specific theological and political agendas while silencing others. The most telling evidence isn't what's included in the Bible, but what's conspicuously absent. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under Emperor Constantine's direction, wasn't merely organizing scripture, it was executing a strategic erasure of competing spiritual traditions, particularly those with African origins. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Book of Enoch were deliberately excluded, not because they lacked spiritual value, but because they contained references to spiritual practices and cosmologies that originated in ancient black civilizations. Have you ever wondered why ancient Egyptian spiritual practices, a sophisticated system that existed thousands of years before Christianity, receive almost no acknowledgement in biblical texts despite the Bible's numerous Egyptian settings? This was deliberately hidden. Moses, raised in Pharaoh's court, would have been initiated into Egyptian mystery schools, yet this profound influence on his spiritual development is systematically downplayed. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, revealed texts that had been suppressed for centuries. These Gnostic Gospels presented a dramatically different understanding of Jesus' teachings, one that emphasized direct spiritual knowledge rather than institutional authority. Many of these texts contain clear references to spiritual practices that originated in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Nubia. Why were these connections silenced? What spiritual power were the censors attempting to keep from humanity? Think with me for a moment. Why would religious authorities go to such extraordinary lengths to eliminate references to pre-existing black spiritual traditions? What were they afraid you might discover about your spiritual heritage? The silence speaks volumes. When the Christian Church was being established as the dominant religious authority in the Roman Empire, it needed to present itself as unique and divinely ordained. Acknowledging that many of its rituals, symbols, and concepts were adaptations of much older African spiritual practices would have undermined this claim to exclusive divine authority. The most compelling evidence of this deliberate erasure isn't just in what was removed from the Bible, but in the archaeological record that contradicts the sanitized history we've been taught. The ancient Black spiritual traditions developed sophisticated understandings of astronomy, sacred geometry, and consciousness that predated biblical writings by thousands of years. In our next chapter, we'll examine the specific evidence of these ancient Black spiritual systems and their profound influence on what would later become world religions. Have you noticed how history books rarely acknowledge the African origins of spiritual concepts? Comment, I see the pattern, if you're beginning to recognize this systematic erasure of Black spiritual heritage. To understand the magnitude of what has been concealed, we must establish the historical reality. Long before the Bible was compiled, ancient Black civilizations in Africa had developed sophisticated spiritual systems that influenced the entire ancient world. These weren't primitive practices as often portrayed, but complex theological frameworks with advanced understandings of cosmology, consciousness, and spiritual transformation. The Kemetic, ancient Egyptian spiritual system, dates back to at least 4000 BCE, more than 2 millennia before the earliest biblical texts were written. The pyramid texts, inscribed in the pyramids of Saqqara around 2400 BCE, represent the oldest known religious writings in the world. These texts reveal a profound spiritual understanding, including concepts of resurrection, eternal life, and divine judgment that would later appear in Abrahamic religions. But this is just the beginning. The Ethiopian Tewahedo tradition preserves texts like the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, ancient scriptures excluded from the Western biblical canon, despite being quoted in the New Testament itself. Why would texts referenced by biblical authors be excluded from the Bible? The Book of Enoch, particularly, contains detailed cosmological teachings that align with ancient African understandings of the universe and humanity's place within it. Stop and think with me. What does it mean when the very texts cited by biblical authors are later deemed unworthy of inclusion in the Bible? Who made these decisions and what motivated them? The ancient Nubians of Sudan developed spiritual practices centered around direct divine communion that predated similar concepts in later religions. The spiritual system of the Kingdom of Kush influenced Egyptian religion and, by extension, the wider Mediterranean world. Archaeological evidence at sites like Jebel Barkal reveals temples dedicated to spiritual practices that would be echoed centuries later in biblical narratives, but without acknowledgement of their African origins. Perhaps most revealing is the ancient library of Timbuktu, which preserved over 700,000 manuscripts, many dating back to the 13th century. These texts document sophisticated African theological traditions that existed independently of European influence. When these manuscripts were threatened by extremists in 2012, local families risked their lives to preserve this evidence of Africa's profound spiritual heritage, a heritage that doesn't align with the narrative of Africa as a spiritually undeveloped continent awaiting salvation through the Bible. This pattern of African spiritual innovation, followed by appropriation without attribution, is not a coincidence. It reveals a systematic effort to sever people of African descent from their spiritual heritage while repurposing elements of that heritage under different authorship. The ancient Black religion was not simply erased. Its most powerful elements were first extracted, recontextualized, and then presented as originating elsewhere. This isn't mere historical oversight. It represents one of history's most consequential acts of spiritual and cultural appropriation. What spiritual practices have you inherited that might have originated in these ancient African traditions? Have you felt drawn to spiritual concepts that seem to resonate with something deeper than what you've been taught? Comment below with ancestral resonance if you've experienced this spiritual connection that transcends what's written in standardized religious texts. What we're uncovering goes far beyond academic debate or historical curiosity. We are witnessing the evidence of an invisible spiritual battle that has raged for millennia. A deliberate campaign to disconnect Black people from their profound spiritual heritage and replace it with narratives that position them as spiritual recipients rather than spiritual originators. The core revelation is this: the oldest Black religion wasn't merely similar to later spiritual systems, it was their foundation. The concepts of monotheism, resurrection, divine judgment, and the soul's immortality were fully developed in ancient Black civilizations thousands of years before appearing in the Bible. The ancient Kemetic concept of Neter, the supreme divine principle, preceded biblical monotheism. The resurrection of Osiris established the pattern for resurrection narratives that would appear millennia later. These weren't primitive approximations. They were sophisticated theological frameworks developed by advanced civilizations. When European powers encountered African spiritual traditions during the colonial era, they faced a profound contradiction. These pagan religions contained spiritual insights and moral frameworks that rivaled or exceeded those in European Christianity. Rather than acknowledging this spiritual sophistication, colonial powers labeled African spiritual practices as demonic, primitive, or superstitious, creating a false dichotomy between enlightened European religion and dark African spirituality. This spiritual warfare continues today in subtle but powerful ways. Academic institutions still largely present world religious history as originating in the Middle East and Europe, with Africa's contributions minimized or ignored. Religious organizations continue teaching that African spiritual systems represent dark practices, requiring replacement rather than ancient wisdom deserving respect. Even well-meaning spiritual seekers often appropriate African spiritual elements without acknowledging their origins. Forces operating in the shadows have maintained this historical amnesia because spiritual identity is central to human identity. When you disconnect people from their spiritual heritage, you can more easily reshape their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. The erasure of ancient Black religion from historical consciousness wasn't just about controlling religious narrative. It was about controlling how Black people worldwide understand their own identity and potential. Have you ever noticed how certain aspects of your spiritual experiences aren't fully addressed in mainstream religious teachings? How specific dreams, intuitions, or spiritual sensitivities you possess seem to connect to something older and deeper than what's acknowledged in conventional religious spaces? This battle continues in how history is taught, in which spiritual practices are validated versus criminalized, and in whose spiritual authority is recognized. The ancient Egyptian Ankh symbol, representing eternal life, predates the Christian cross by thousands of years. Yet one is labeled religious, and the other cultural, or even occult. This distinction isn't based on historical chronology, but on whose spiritual heritage is being centered. The reclamation of this spiritual heritage isn't about rejecting any faith tradition, but about restoring the complete spiritual lineage of humanity. It's about recognizing that the spiritual wisdom we all benefit from today has deep roots in ancient Black civilizations that have been systematically erased from our collective memory. In our journey toward spiritual wholeness, acknowledging these erased origins isn't optional, it's essential. No one can fully understand world spiritual traditions without recognizing the foundational role of ancient Black religions in developing the concepts, practices, and frameworks that would later appear in scriptures worldwide. What aspects of your spiritual life might connect back to these ancient traditions? Comment spiritual remembrance. If you're beginning to recognize elements of your own spiritual experience that might have roots in these ancient Black spiritual systems, the erasure of the world's oldest Black religion wasn't a simple historical accident or oversight. It was a calculated, multi-generational campaign executed through specific historical events and institutions. To understand how such profound spiritual knowledge could be nearly erased from human consciousness, we must examine the methodical process through which this erasure was accomplished. The first major attack came during the Greco-Roman period. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, his successors established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which began the process of appropriating Egyptian spiritual concepts while gradually disconnecting them from their African origins. The Great Library of Alexandria, while preserving knowledge, also served to recontextualize Egyptian wisdom under Greek authorship and terminology. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I delivered perhaps the most devastating blow in 391 CE when he ordered the destruction of all pagan temples throughout the empire. The Temple of Serapis in Alexandria, containing irreplaceable ancient manuscripts, was demolished, and with it, countless volumes documenting ancient African spiritual teachings. This wasn't simply religious zeal. It was the systematic destruction of evidence that would have contradicted the emerging narrative about the origins of spiritual wisdom. The Council of Carthage in 397 CE finalized the biblical canon for Western Christianity, explicitly excluding texts that maintained stronger connections to African spiritual traditions. This wasn't just about determining which texts were divinely inspired. It was about controlling which spiritual heritage would be acknowledged and which would be suppressed. Perhaps most systematically damaging was the European slave trade, which deliberately targeted the destruction of African spiritual systems. Enslaved Africans were forbidden from practicing their traditional spirituality. Their spiritual leaders were often killed first, and their sacred objects were destroyed. This wasn't merely about labor control, it was about spiritual domination. Colonizers understood that people connected to their ancestral spiritual traditions would be harder to subjugate. Think about this deeply. Have you ever questioned why so many ancient African temples and spiritual centers were specifically targeted for destruction throughout history? Why was it necessary to not just convert people, but to completely eradicate their spiritual texts, symbols, and practices? These weren't random acts of conquest, but a systematically erased spiritual heritage. The spiritual traditions that developed in ancient Kemet, Nubia, Ethiopia, and throughout Africa were deliberately obscured, not because they were less developed, but precisely because they were so profound that they threatened later claims of spiritual innovation and divine exclusivity. This conspiracy continued into modern times through academic institutions that classified African spiritual systems as mythology, while presenting Greek, Roman, and biblical narratives as religion or history. Even today, education systems worldwide teach Egyptian mythology alongside biblical history, creating an artificial distinction that has no basis in chronology or historical significance. The consequences of this historical conspiracy extend into our present reality. Many people of African descent worldwide practice spiritual traditions without knowing their historical roots or full spiritual significance. The symbols, practices, and concepts developed by their ancestors have been repackaged and presented back to them as foreign innovations. Do you trust the historical narrative you've been taught about the origins of world religions? Have you been shown the complete spiritual heritage of humanity, or only the portions that support a particular narrative about who originated spiritual wisdom? Comment, historical awakening. If you're beginning to see how this conspiracy has shaped your own understanding of religious history, the ancient Black spiritual traditions that were systematically erased didn't simply disappear. They fragmented, went underground, and continued through hidden channels that preserved crucial elements of this ancestral wisdom. By examining these surviving connections, we can begin reconstructing the spiritual heritage that was nearly lost to humanity. The Kemetic, ancient Egyptian understanding of the divine feminine principle through goddesses like Isis, found its way into early Christianity through the veneration of Mary, despite efforts to diminish this connection. The Kemetic concept of the Divine Mother nursing the sacred child predates Christian iconography of Mary and Jesus by thousands of years. This isn't coincidental. It represents the persistence of ancient African spiritual understandings even after official erasure. In Ethiopia, one of the world's oldest continuous Christian traditions maintained stronger connections to ancient African spirituality. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved books excluded from the Western biblical canon and maintained spiritual practices that bridge ancient African traditions with Christianity. Their unique crosses, rhythmic worship, and understanding of angels all reflect this older African spiritual foundation that was largely severed in European Christianity. The African spiritual understanding of ancestor veneration and communion, often demonized by colonial religions, represents one of the most profound theological frameworks for understanding human spiritual continuity. This ancestral knowledge recognized that the boundary between the living and ancestors is permeable, that wisdom flows across generations, and that those who came before us remain accessible as guides and protectors. Reflect for a moment on your own sense of connection to those who came before you. Have you experienced moments of guidance or insight that seem to come from beyond your individual knowledge? These experiences connect to an ancient African understanding of spiritual reality that preceded biblical writings. The lost connections extend into sacred science as well. Ancient Black civilizations developed precise astronomical knowledge that informed their spiritual practices. The alignment of monuments like the Great Pyramid with celestial bodies, the accurate tracking of stellar movements, and the development of calendars far more precise than later European versions, all demonstrate a sophisticated integration of spiritual and scientific understanding that was deliberately fragmented during colonial periods. Perhaps most significant are the spiritual technologies for accessing altered states of consciousness that originated in ancient African traditions. Rhythmic drumming, breathwork, movement practices, and plant medicines were all developed as sophisticated methods for expanding consciousness and accessing spiritual dimensions. These technologies were systematically criminalized during colonial periods precisely because they offered direct spiritual access without institutional mediation. These forgotten connections weren't severed completely, but were forced underground. In the Americas, traditions like Vodou, Candomblé, and Santeria preserved elements of ancient African spiritual systems under the guise of Catholic saints. In Africa itself, traditional spiritual practices continued in rural areas despite colonial prohibition. Even in Europe, esoteric traditions often preserved fragments of ancient African spiritual knowledge while obscuring its origins. The reconnection with this ancestral wisdom isn't about rejecting any faith tradition, but about restoring what was forcibly taken from humanity's spiritual heritage. It's about recognizing that spiritual systems worldwide contain elements that originated in ancient Black civilizations, whether this origin is acknowledged or not. What aspects of your own cultural or spiritual background might contain these hidden connections to ancient African wisdom? Have you maintained practices or understandings that resonate with this older spiritual heritage? Comment ancestral wisdom if you recognize elements of these forgotten connections in your own spiritual or cultural experience. As we uncover the truth about how the world's oldest Black religion was systematically erased, a profound personal awakening becomes possible. This isn't merely historical information. It's the key to reconnecting with spiritual wisdom that may already be stirring within you, waiting to be recognized and reclaimed. The first sign of this awakening often comes as a sense of spiritual déjà vu, moments when you encounter concepts from ancient African traditions and feel an inexplicable familiarity, as if your soul recognizes wisdom that your conscious mind has never been taught. You might find yourself drawn to certain symbols, rhythms, or practices without understanding why. These aren't random attractions, but your spiritual consciousness recognizing fragments of its heritage. Have you experienced dreams with symbols or guidance that seem to come from beyond your personal experience? Many people report dreams featuring ankhs, pyramids, or ancient African symbols before ever studying these traditions. Your spiritual eyes are opening to what has always been part of your spiritual DNA, though systematically hidden from your conscious awareness. The awakening process continues as you begin recognizing patterns in your intuitive abilities that align with ancient African spiritual understandings. The tradition of second sight, or spiritual perception beyond physical reality, was highly developed in ancient Black religions long before it was demonized as superstition by colonial powers. Your natural intuitive abilities may connect directly to these ancient spiritual technologies. To accelerate this awakening, create a daily practice of spiritual remembrance. Spend 20 minutes each morning in meditation, asking to be reconnected with the spiritual wisdom of your ancestors. Visualize roots extending from your body deep into the earth, connecting you with countless generations who maintained spiritual wisdom despite systematic attempts to sever this connection. This isn't fantasy. It's the activation of spiritual memory that transcends individual experience. Study the symbols of ancient African spiritual systems, like the Adinkra symbols of the Akan people, or the hieroglyphic system of ancient Kemet. Don't just observe them intellectually, but sit with them meditatively, allowing your deeper consciousness to recognize and commune with these carriers of ancient wisdom. Many people report profound emotional responses when reconnecting with symbols their ancestors revered for thousands of years. The most powerful aspect of this awakening comes in recognizing that spiritual authority lies within you, not exclusively in external texts or institutions. Ancient Black spiritual systems understood that each person has direct access to divine wisdom through their connection to both ancestors and the divine consciousness that permeates all reality. This understanding was specifically targeted for erasure because it empowers individuals rather than institutions. As your consciousness expands through this reawakening, you may experience challenging emotions: anger at the systematic suppression of this heritage, grief for what was lost, confusion as your previous spiritual understanding is recontextualized. These responses aren't obstacles but necessary aspects of the healing process as you reintegrate what was forcibly fragmented. The ultimate fruit of this personal awakening is a profound spiritual homecoming, recognizing that you're not a spiritual orphan waiting to be adopted into someone else's tradition, but the inheritor of one of humanity's most sophisticated and ancient spiritual lineages. This recognition doesn't separate you from others, but connects you more authentically to the shared spiritual heritage of all humanity. Have you felt this awakening beginning within you? Have you experienced moments of recognition or remembrance that connect you to spiritual wisdom beyond what you've been formally taught? Share your testimony in the comments with "My Awakening Journey." and help others recognize their own process of spiritual remembrance. The revelation about how the world's oldest black religion was erased by the Bible isn't just transforming individual consciousness, it's catalyzing a global spiritual awakening that has profound implications for humanity's future. As more people reconnect with this suppressed spiritual heritage, we're witnessing the birth of a collective movement that transcends individual enlightenment. Around the world, communities are rediscovering and reclaiming ancient African spiritual wisdom that was nearly lost to humanity. In Brazil, the United States, the Caribbean, and throughout the African diaspora, people are openly practicing spiritual traditions with African roots that were once criminalized. In academic institutions, scholars are re-examining ancient texts with fresh eyes, recognizing the African origins of concepts long attributed to other sources. In spiritual communities worldwide, practices like meditation, ancestral reverence, and cosmic alignment, all developed in ancient African traditions, are being restored to their proper historical context. This global awakening isn't happening without resistance. Powerful forces continue working to maintain the historical amnesia that has kept this spiritual heritage obscured. Religious institutions that have built their authority on claims of exclusive divine revelation are threatened by evidence that many of their core concepts originated in much older African spiritual systems. Academic institutions invested in Eurocentric historical narratives resist revising fundamental assumptions about the origins of philosophical and spiritual concepts. Even well-meaning spiritual seekers sometimes struggle to recognize how deeply the erasure of African spiritual heritage has shaped their understanding of spirituality itself. These resistance forces operate through familiar channels, dismissing new historical evidence as controversial, labeling the reclamation of African spiritual practices as cultural regression, and continuing to present world spiritual history as originating primarily in the Middle East and Europe. They rely on the inertia of established narratives and the human tendency to defend beliefs that form the foundation of identity. Yet despite this resistance, the awakening continues to accelerate. We are living in a prophesied time when hidden knowledge returns to light, a time ancient African traditions themselves predicted would come after periods of darkness and forgetting. This isn't just coincidence. It's the fulfillment of spiritual understanding preserved by those who maintain these traditions through centuries of suppression. Our collective role in this awakening is both simple and profound: to become conscious participants in the restoration of humanity's complete spiritual heritage. This means educating ourselves beyond mainstream historical narratives, supporting the preservation and teaching of ancient African spiritual wisdom, and creating communities where this reconnection can flourish. It means standing firmly against attempts to dismiss or demonize these ancient traditions, while building bridges of understanding with those from all spiritual backgrounds. Together we are dismantling centuries of spiritual colonization, not to create new divisions, but to heal the artificial divisions created by the erasure of our shared spiritual origins. We are rediscovering that humanity's spiritual heritage isn't a collection of competing traditions, but a diverse expression of wisdom with deep common roots in ancient African understandings. The time for this collective awakening isn't arbitrary. It comes at a crucial moment when humanity faces unprecedented challenges requiring wisdom beyond conventional thinking. The holistic spiritual understanding developed in ancient Black civilizations, recognizing the interconnection of all life, the continuity between ancestors and the living, and humanity's responsibility as stewards of creation, offers crucial guidance for navigating our current global crises. Are you ready to take your place in this collective awakening? Do you recognize your role in restoring what was taken from humanity's spiritual heritage? Comment, "I stand with truth," if you're committed to being part of this global movement to reclaim our complete spiritual heritage. At the heart of the world's oldest Black religion lies a system of sacred mysteries, profound spiritual understandings that were carefully preserved and transmitted through initiatory traditions. These weren't mere beliefs, but technologies for transformation and direct spiritual knowledge that predated the Bible by thousands of years. By examining these sacred mysteries, we can glimpse the depth of what was nearly erased from human consciousness. The most foundational mystery teaching from ancient Kemet was the understanding of Neter Neteru, the divine principle behind all divine manifestations. This sophisticated monotheistic concept recognized one ultimate source while acknowledging its expression through multiple divine attributes. This wasn't primitive polytheism as often portrayed. but a nuanced understanding of how the infinite divine manifests through specific qualities humans can comprehend. This teaching predated biblical monotheism by millennia and offered a more philosophically sophisticated framework for understanding divine unity in diversity. Ancient Black spiritual traditions developed a profound understanding of sacred geometry as the pattern language of creation. The relationship between mathematics, music, astronomy, and spiritual reality wasn't merely theoretical, but practical knowledge used in the construction of temples, the composition of sacred music, and the development of meditation practices. The geometric proportions found in structures like the Great Pyramid encode sophisticated mathematical understandings that modern science has only recently rediscovered. The mystery system of ancient Kemet, which operated through temple schools known as Per Ankh, houses of life, developed a comprehensive curriculum for spiritual development. Initiates progressed through levels of teaching that integrated astronomy, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and spiritual practice. This wasn't just education, but transformation, designed to awaken latent human capabilities and align individual consciousness with cosmic principles. Take a moment to contemplate the number 42 in ancient Kemetic tradition. The 42 laws of Ma'at represented a moral and spiritual code far more detailed than the later 10 Commandments. These principles guided not just external behavior, but internal spiritual alignment, covering truthfulness, environmental stewardship, treatment of animals, mental discipline, and relationship with ancestors. The sophistication of this ethical system demonstrates the advanced spiritual understanding developed in ancient Black civilizations. Perhaps the most profound mystery teaching concerned the nature of human consciousness itself. Ancient African spiritual traditions recognized that consciousness isn't produced by the brain, but is a fundamental property of the universe that the human organism can access and channel. This understanding informed spiritual practices designed to expand awareness beyond individual identity, what we might now call non-dual consciousness or cosmic awareness. To connect with these mystery teachings today, practice the ancient meditation of Neb Heru, all face. Sit in silence with eyes closed, breathing deeply and naturally. Visualize your awareness expanding beyond your body to include your environment, then your community, then all of humanity, then all life forms, then the planet, solar system, and cosmos. Feel yourself as both an individual and an expression of the infinite whole. This practice, taught in ancient African mystery schools, dissolves the illusion of separation that causes human suffering. The sacred mysteries weren't meant to remain obscured forever. Ancient wisdom keepers preserved these teachings through oral tradition, encoded symbolism, and hidden manuscripts with the understanding that future generations would need to rediscover this knowledge after periods of forgetting. We are now in the time of remembering, when these sacred teachings return to benefit humanity. The revelation of these mystery teachings doesn't diminish any faith tradition, but enriches our understanding of humanity's spiritual heritage. By recognizing the sophisticated spiritual technologies developed in ancient Black civilizations, we gain a more complete picture of human spiritual development and recover tools for transformation that benefit people of all backgrounds. Have you experienced moments of expanded consciousness that connect with these ancient mystery teachings? Have certain symbols, numbers, or spiritual concepts awakened deeper understanding within you? Share your mystical experiences in the comments with Mystery Revealed and join others who are reconnecting with this profound spiritual heritage. The erasure of the world's oldest Black religion wasn't a random historical event, but part of a larger prophetic timeline that was itself understood and predicted within ancient African spiritual traditions. By placing current events within this prophetic framework, we gain profound insight into both our present moment and humanity's spiritual future. Ancient Kemetic texts like the Prophecy of Neferti, dating to around 2000 BCE, and prophecies preserved in Nubian and Ethiopian traditions described cycles of spiritual light and darkness. These traditions foretold periods when spiritual wisdom would be suppressed, sacred sites destroyed, and ancestral connections broken, followed by times of remembrance, restoration, and spiritual reawakening. According to these ancient prophecies, humanity would endure a dark age of spiritual disconnection before a great awakening, when hidden knowledge would return to light. The timeline described in these ancient prophecies aligns with historical events with remarkable precision. The systematic suppression of African spiritual systems intensified during specific historical periods. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, 391 CE, the Council of Nicaea, 325 CE, the Inquisition's targeting of African spiritual practices, 1478 CE, and the height of the colonial era, 17th to 19th centuries. These weren't random events but concentrated efforts to sever humanity from its original spiritual heritage. These same prophetic traditions foretold signs that would mark the beginning of the Great Remembering, the time when suppressed spiritual knowledge would return to human consciousness. These signs included increased dreams and visions connecting people to ancient wisdom, the discovery of hidden texts and artifacts, unprecedented access to information across geographical boundaries, and environmental changes that would awaken humanity to its relationship with the natural world. Look around at current world events through this prophetic lens. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 brought suppressed spiritual texts back into public consciousness. The civil rights and independence movements of the 20th century created space for the open practice of African spiritual traditions. The digital revolution has allowed unprecedented access to information about ancient spiritual systems. Climate change is forcing humanity to reconsider its relationship with the natural world, a relationship that was central to ancient African spiritual understanding. According to these prophetic traditions, we are now living in the early stages of the Great Remembering, a period when humanity begins reintegrating the spiritual wisdom that was systematically fragmented. This isn't just spiritual theory, but is visible in concrete developments. The growing academic recognition of Africa's foundational role in human spiritual development, the increasing practice of meditation and mindfulness, techniques with roots in ancient African traditions, and the rising interest in ancestral connection across cultures. The prophetic timeline doesn't end with simply remembering what was lost. Ancient traditions describe this remembering as preparation for humanity's next spiritual evolution, a transition to what Kemetic tradition called the horizon of the Aten, or the age of expanded consciousness. This isn't a return to the past, but an integration of ancient wisdom with new understanding, creating spiritual frameworks capable of addressing humanity's current challenges. Most significantly, these prophetic traditions emphasize that this spiritual reawakening isn't the province of any single cultural group, but the birthright of all humanity. The restoration of knowledge about humanity's spiritual origins in Africa doesn't divide people, but reunites them with their shared heritage, a heritage that was deliberately fragmented to facilitate control through division. Where do you see yourself in this prophetic timeline? Have you noticed the signs of remembering and reawakening in your own life and community? Do you recognize your role in this prophesied restoration of spiritual knowledge? Comment: prophetic awareness. If you sense the significance of our current moment within this larger spiritual timeline. We've journeyed together through revelations about how the world's oldest black religion was systematically erased when the Bible was compiled. We've examined the historical evidence, uncovered the forgotten connections, explored the sacred mysteries, and recognized our place in the prophetic timeline. Now comes the most crucial question. What will we do with this knowledge? How will we respond to the truth we've uncovered? This journey began with discovering the historical reality that sophisticated spiritual systems developed in ancient black civilizations thousands of years before the Bible, and that these systems were deliberately erased from historical consciousness. We explored how this erasure wasn't accidental but strategic, executed through specific historical events and institutions. We uncovered the forgotten connections that survived despite systematic suppression, and examined the sacred mysteries that represent some of humanity's most profound spiritual wisdom. Throughout this exploration, we've witnessed how the awakening to this truth is transforming both individual consciousness and collective understanding. We've placed our current moment within the prophetic timeline foretold by ancient traditions themselves, recognizing that we live in the time of remembering after centuries of forgetting. This knowledge demands more than intellectual acknowledgement. It requires transformation. The mandate before us is clear: to participate consciously in the restoration of humanity's complete spiritual heritage. This isn't about rejecting any faith tradition, but about reclaiming the fullness of spiritual wisdom that belongs to all humanity. The first step in this transformation is personal awakening. Break the chains of historical amnesia by educating yourself beyond mainstream narratives. Study the spiritual systems of ancient Kemet, Nubia, Ethiopia, and other African civilizations, not as historical curiosities, but as living wisdom traditions with profound relevance for contemporary life. Practice meditation techniques developed in these ancient traditions to experience directly what academic study can only describe. Liberate your consciousness from the artificial limitations created by historical erasure. Recognize that your spiritual heritage doesn't begin with the Bible but extends thousands of years earlier to some of humanity's most sophisticated spiritual understandings. Reclaim your spiritual birthright by reconnecting with the wisdom traditions of your ancestors, whether through direct lineage or our shared human heritage. Transform your relationship with divine reality by recognizing the more nuanced understanding of divine manifestation developed in ancient African traditions. Break free from rigid theological frameworks that were often designed specifically to replace older, more sophisticated spiritual understandings. Reconnect with the direct experience of divine reality that was central to ancient African spiritual practice. Our mandate extends beyond personal transformation to collective action. Share this knowledge respectfully but boldly with others seeking deeper understanding. Support educational initiatives that present accurate information about the African origins of many spiritual concepts and practices. Create community spaces where this ancestral wisdom can be explored, practiced, and integrated into contemporary life. Stand firmly against continuing attempts to dismiss or demonize ancient African spiritual traditions. Challenge historical narratives that begin human spiritual development with the Bible, rather than acknowledging the sophisticated spiritual systems that preceded it by millennia. Support the preservation of ancient African spiritual sites, texts, and practices as crucial aspects of humanity's shared heritage. Above all, remember that you are not merely a recipient of spiritual wisdom, but a carrier of divine light with the capacity to access direct spiritual knowledge. The ancient African understanding that each human contains a spark of divine consciousness wasn't erased because it was false, but because it was too empowering, threatening systems that required spiritual dependency rather than spiritual autonomy. Will you accept your divine heritage and the responsibility it brings? Will you take your place in the restoration of humanity's complete spiritual lineage? Will you become a conscious participant in the great remembering that ancient traditions prophesied would follow centuries of forgetting? Take a moment now for reflection and commitment. Place your hand over your heart and say aloud, "I reclaim my complete spiritual heritage. I stand in the truth of humanity's shared spiritual origins. I commit to being a vessel for this ancient wisdom in our modern world." This journey of spiritual reclamation isn't just about historical correction. It's about humanity's future. The wisdom preserved in ancient Black spiritual traditions offers crucial guidance for addressing our current global challenges. The understanding of human interconnection with all life, the sophisticated ethical frameworks, and the technologies for expanded consciousness developed in these traditions provide tools we desperately need in our present moment. What specific step will you take to honor and reclaim this spiritual heritage? Will you begin a daily practice of connection with ancestral wisdom? Will you share this knowledge with others seeking deeper understanding? Will you support efforts to preserve and restore ancient African spiritual sites and texts? Comment, "My sacred commitment," followed by the specific action you commit to taking as part of this great restoration. You've reached the end of this revelation, but in truth, this is just the beginning of your journey. The fact that you've stayed with this message to its conclusion marks you as a genuine truth seeker, someone with the courage to question established narratives and the wisdom to recognize deeper truths when they're revealed. What we've uncovered together is nothing less than the systematic erasure of humanity's most ancient spiritual heritage, the sophisticated Black religions that predated the Bible by thousands of years and influenced virtually all subsequent spiritual traditions. We've seen how the Council of Nicaea, colonial powers, and religious institutions strategically removed references to these ancient African origins, creating an artificial historical narrative that positioned Africa as a spiritual recipient rather than a spiritual originator. Most importantly, we've recognized our place in the prophetic timeline, living in the time of remembering that ancient traditions themselves foretold would follow centuries of forgetting. This revelation transforms not just how you understand religious history, but how you understand yourself. You aren't a spiritual orphan waiting to receive wisdom from elsewhere, but the inheritor of one of humanity's most sophisticated spiritual lineages. The reconnection with this ancestral wisdom restores your spiritual identity, and empowers you to access direct spiritual knowledge as your ancestors did for thousands of years before religious institutions positioned themselves as necessary intermediaries between humanity and divine wisdom. Now, I invite you to take specific actions to support this great remembering. Subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell to receive future revelations that will continue expanding your understanding of suppressed spiritual history. Like this video to help the algorithm share this knowledge with others seeking deeper truth. Comment, "Spiritual Heritage Reclaimed," to affirm your commitment to this awakening journey and connect with others on the same path. Most importantly, share this video with at least 3 people who you believe are ready to receive this knowledge, becoming part of the prophesied restoration of humanity's complete spiritual heritage. In our next revelation, we'll dive even deeper into the specific spiritual technologies developed in ancient Black civilizations, techniques for accessing expanded consciousness, communicating with ancestors, and aligning with cosmic cycles that were systematically suppressed during colonial periods. These aren't just historical curiosities, but powerful spiritual tools that can transform your life today. Are you ready to reclaim these spiritual technologies that rightfully belong to all humanity? Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss this crucial next chapter in our journey of revelation.